He turned the ring over in his fingers the way other men turned rosary beads, not in prayer, but in the absence of it. The wolf's head caught the firelight and held it, silver warming against his skin as if it had a pulse of its own. As if it were alive in a way he had long since stopped believing he was. His father had worn it until the night he couldn't. His grandfather before that, and his grandfather's father before him, a chain of men who had pressed that same crest into wax, into skin, into the memories of anyone who had ever been foolish enough to cross the Callahan name. Killian had inherited the ring at 19. He had never once worn it lightly. Tonight, though, it felt different. Not heavier, he was used to the weight. It felt wrong, the way a compass feels wrong when it can no longer find north. He didn't understand it then. He slid the ring back onto his finger, rose from his father's chair, and walked out into the rain toward the docks, toward the raid, toward the rest of his life, still believing he was the kind of man who decided how things ended. The rain had not let up. It came in hard off the harbor now, no longer the quiet, confessional kind that had streaked his study windows. This was something angrier, something with intent. It drove itself into the necks of Killian's men as they fanned out across Pier 9 in the dark, their breath visible in short, controlled bursts, their boots finding the wet concrete with the practiced silence of men who had done this many times before and fully intended to do it many times again. Killian moved through them like a current. Black coat, black gloves, the wolf's head ring hidden beneath the leather. Finn walked 3 paces behind him, close enough to be useful, far enough to give Killian the illusion of solitude he always needed before something like this. The docks smelled of brine and rust and the particular kind of cold that finds the spaces between your bones and decides to live there. The intelligence had been clean. 2 Falcon shipments, scheduled to move through Pier 9 before 3 in the morning, carrying enough product to fund the Falcon operation for the next 8 months. Killian's source inside the Falcon network had been reliable for 2 years. There was no reason to doubt it tonight. He doubted it anyway. He always doubted everything, right up until the moment it was over. It was the habit that had kept him alive when better men than him had grown comfortable and stopped looking over their shoulder. So when the first gunshot cracked across the pier like a bone breaking, he was already moving before the echo died. It wasn't a shipment. It was a welcome party. The Falcons had known. Somehow, through a leak he hadn't yet located, through a betrayal that hadn't yet shown its face, Giovanni Falcone had known they were coming, and he had set the stage accordingly. The shipping containers along the east wall erupted with men, 8, 10, 12 of them spilling into the floodlit dark with weapons already raised, already firing. Killian's crew scattered and returned fire with the disciplined fury of men who understood that hesitation was just another word for a grave. Steel rang off corrugated metal. Someone screamed. The harbor swallowed the sound. Killian took cover behind a concrete pillar and took stock. He had 12 men on the pier. The Falcons had more, and the element of surprise. The calculus was simple and it was ugly. Hold ground long enough to extract, neutralize what you can, and get everyone off the pier before the police scanner Finn monitored picked up the first cruiser rolling toward the waterfront. He was moving toward Finn's position along the far row of containers when he heard it. Not a gunshot. Not breaking glass or the wet slap of boots on concrete. Something smaller. Something that did not belong to the grammar of a firefight at all. A single, sharp intake of breath, the sound a person makes when they have been holding themselves perfectly still for a very long time and something has frightened them into forgetting. He stopped. It came from the container to his left, a 40-foot steel box, dark red, its doors sealed with a manual latch that someone had not quite pulled flush. A half-inch gap. A thread of interior darkness slightly different from the darkness outside. He stood there in the rain with gunfire moving behind him and something cold and entirely unstrategic turning over in his chest, and he did not walk on. He put his hand on the latch. She was pressed into the far corner, her knees drawn up, her back against the corrugated steel wall. In the thin gray light that fell through the gap in the doors, she looked like something carved from porcelain and left unfinished, all sharp angles and held breath and eyes that were very dark and very alert and pointed directly at the gun in his hand. She did not scream. He noted that first. Most people screamed. She simply looked at him with an expression that was equal parts terror and the kind of defiance that takes years to grow, and she said, very quietly, in a voice that did not shake nearly as much as it should have, "Go ahead. My father will kill you either way." Killian looked at her for a long moment. The firefight was still happening behind him. He could hear it, could track the positions of his men by sound the way a conductor tracks an orchestra in the dark, but something in him had gone very still, the way it goes still before a decision that cannot be undone. She was young. Not a child, there was nothing childlike in those eyes, but young in the way that people are young before the world has finished with them. Her dark hair was plastered to her face from the harbor damp, and she was wearing a coat 2 sizes too large, falcon made from the cut of it, and beneath the smell of salt and rust and fear was something incongruous and almost absurd, expensive perfume, still clinging to her skin like a rumor of somewhere warmer. He knew who she was before she told him. Giovanni Falcone had one daughter. Everyone in the underworld knew it, the way they knew not to look directly at certain things, because knowing too much about them made you responsible for what you did with the knowledge. C.F. Falcone. 23 years old. Kept, from everything his intelligence suggested, at a careful remove from her father's business, a jewel in a case, pristine and untouchable and utterly unaware of how thoroughly the men around her had arranged the world to keep her that way. Except that she was here, crouched in a shipping container on a Callahan pier in the middle of a firefight that her father had orchestrated, which meant that either Giovanni's control over his daughter was not as absolute as advertised, or she was something other than what she appeared. He had not lowered the gun. She had not looked away from it. "C.F. Falcone," he said. Not a question. Something moved behind her eyes, recognition, recalibration, the rapid and private mathematics of someone who has just understood exactly how much danger they are in. But her chin lifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "Killian Callahan," she said back, in the same tone he had used, flat, precise, a name weaponized into a sentence. "I've seen your photograph. You're shorter than I expected." He almost, not quite, but almost, smiled. Outside, Finn's voice cut through the noise on the comms piece in his ear. "We need to move, Killian, now, they've called for backup." The firefight was folding. His men were pulling back. In 40 seconds this pier would belong entirely to the Falcones and whatever remained of the night. The law of the underworld was simple and it was without sentiment. You left nothing useful behind, and you left nothing dangerous standing. C.F. Falcone, in the hands of a Callahan, was leverage of a kind that came along once in a generation. The cold part of his mind, the part that his father had trained and his grandfather before him, the part that had kept the wolf's head ring passing from hand to hand, knew exactly what she was worth and exactly what ought to happen next. He lowered the gun. He didn't examine why. "Get up," he said. "Stay close. Don't speak." She stared at him for one more second, measuring, he thought, whether this was a crueler trap than the one she was already in, and then she unfolded herself from the corner and stood, and he saw that she was smaller than he'd registered, her head barely reaching his chin. She smelled of gunpowder and rain now, under the perfume. He pulled open the container door and stepped back into the dark with Giovanni Falcone's daughter a half step behind him, and he did not allow himself to think about what Finn would say, or what his men would demand, or what the cold arithmetic of power and survival said he should have done and didn't. He thought only about getting off the pier. The rest of it, the impossibility of her, the weight of what he had just chosen, the compass needle swinging wildly away from every north he had ever known, he would deal with in the morning. He told himself that, walking through the rain toward the car with her footsteps quiet behind him. He told himself he believed it. She said nothing on the drive. Neither did he. That was the first thing he noticed, that she understood silence the way people only do when they have been made to live inside it. Most people, when frightened, filled the air. They bargained or pleaded or manufactured some version of themselves they believed might be more survivable. C.F. Falcone sat in the back of his car with her hands folded in her lap and the city moving past the rain-blurred window, and she was quiet in a way that was not passive. It was chosen. Deliberate. She was thinking, and she was not going to let him see what about. Finn rode in the front passenger seat and said nothing either, though the quality of his silence was entirely different, compressed, volcanic, the silence of a man performing a very great restraint and wanting credit for it. Killian could feel it radiating off him like heat off asphalt in July. The conversation was coming. He would deal with it the way he dealt with everything, on his own terms, in his own time. They reached the estate just before 4 in the morning. Killian brought her in through the side entrance, a practical decision, not a compassionate one, he told himself, and through the long corridor lined with his grandfather's paintings, and into the study. The fire had burned low in his absence but was not yet dead. He crouched and fed it 2 fresh logs without removing his coat, and when he stood and turned, she was standing in the center of the room, dripping faintly onto the old Turkish rug, looking at everything and letting nothing show. She looked at the ledgers. The fireplace. The wingback chair. The untouched glass of Jameson still sitting exactly where he had left it hours ago, amber and reproachful in the firelight. She looked at all of it the way a person looks at a map of a country they have heard terrible things about, with a hunger for information they are careful not to let become fascination. Then she looked at him. "You're going to want something," she said. "People like you always want something. So let's skip the part where you offer me tea and pretend this is a negotiation between equals, and you can just tell me what it is." Killian pulled off his gloves, 1 finger at a time, and set them on the desk. He moved to the drinks cabinet, poured 2 glasses without asking, and carried both to the low table in front of the fire. He set one down on her side and took his own chair and regarded her with the same steady, unhurried attention he gave to everything he was trying to understand. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." "Sia." He said her name the way he said most things, without inflection, without threat, with the particular weight of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be understood. "Sit down. You're bleeding." She looked down. A thin line of dark red was working its way along the back of her left hand, a graze, nothing more, from the corrugated steel of the container wall most likely, but she hadn't felt it until he named it. That was the thing about fear, it was a very efficient anesthetic, right up until it wasn't. She sat. He brought her a cloth from the cabinet drawer without being asked, and she took it without thanking him, and they both pretended that the exchange was entirely practical. He settled back into his chair. The fire had caught fully now, throwing the room into warm amber relief, and the rain against the windows had softened into something almost gentle. In another life, in any life other than the one they had each been born into, it might have been a civilized hour. A civilized scene. 2 people in a firelit room with good whiskey, the city quiet outside. "Your father set us up," Killian said. "He knew we were coming to Pier 9. He had men waiting." He watched her face. "Did you know?" "If I had known," she said, pressing the cloth carefully to the back of her hand, "I would not have been hiding in a shipping container." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." She met his eyes without flinching. "I was there because I followed a man, one of my father's men, who I believed was moving something he shouldn't have been moving. I was trying to find out what. I didn't know it was your pier. I didn't know about any of it. A beat. I'm aware you have no reason to believe that." "No," he agreed. "I don't." She picked up the glass of whiskey and looked at it and set it back down. "And yet you didn't leave me there. And you didn't hand me to your men." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a directness that he found, against every reasonable objection, interesting. "So either you're the type of man who has a policy about women in crossfire, or you want something from me that requires me to be alive and cooperative. Which is it?" Killian looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across her face, across the sharp line of her jaw, the exhaustion she was too proud to acknowledge, the dark eyes that held something fiercer than fear and older than her age. The red dress beneath the oversized falcon coat was the color of something irreversible. He was aware, with a precision that irritated him, that she was beautiful. He was more aware that she knew it and considered it entirely beside the point. "Both," he said finally, which was more honest than he'd intended to be. Something shifted in her expression, not softening, nothing as yielding as that, but a very slight recalibration, as if she had asked a question expecting a lie and the truth had caught her somewhere unguarded. She recovered quickly. He noticed that too. "My father will know I'm missing by morning," she said. "When he doesn't hear from his men at the pier." He already knows. Killian turned the ring on his finger, once. Giovanni Falcone built a trap and walked away from it before it closed. He knows how the pier ended. The only thing he doesn't know yet is whether you were in the container or in the harbor. He let that land. I'd like to keep it that way for a while. The implication settled between them like a stone into water. She would be a ghost. Officially, to her father, to the Falcone network, to anyone with a reason to come looking, she did not yet exist in Callahan's hands. It was a short window, and both of them understood exactly what it meant and exactly how it could be used. You want leverage, she said. Not an accusation. Just a woman naming a thing precisely, the way he imagined she had learned to name things in a world that preferred she didn't understand them at all. I want answers, he said. About what your father's man was moving. About the leak inside my operation that gave him Pier 9. And yes, he held her gaze without apology. About you. About me, she repeated. You followed one of your father's men alone to a waterfront in the middle of the night. That's either very brave or very reckless, and I haven't decided which. He paused. Or you're exactly what your father sent you to be, and this is a much longer game than I've given him credit for. She held his gaze steadily, and for a moment the room held only the sound of fire and rain and the particular silence that forms between two people when they are each waiting to see whether the other will blink first. She reached out and picked up the whiskey. She drank it without ceremony, set the glass down clean, and looked at him with something that was almost, dangerously close to, the beginning of a smile. Then I suppose, she said, you'd better keep me close. Killian said nothing. He turned the ring on his finger again, once, and looked at the fire, and did not examine why those 4 words had landed somewhere deeper than strategy. Finn came to him at 7 in the morning, which meant he had been awake all night working himself toward it. Killian was in the kitchen, a room he rarely used, which perhaps explained why it was the only room in the estate that felt unclaimed, unhaunted by the accumulated authority of Callahan men past. He had made coffee with the focused attention he gave to anything that required his hands and left his mind free to move, and he was standing at the long window watching the estate grounds emerge from the gray Boston dawn when he heard Finn's footsteps in the corridor. Measured. Deliberate. The footsteps of a man rehearsing. She's still here, Finn said from the doorway. Not a question. She is. Killian didn't turn from the window. Finn came into the room and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat in it with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who understood that how you entered a room said something about what you intended to say in it. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been rearranged by violence often enough that it had settled into something permanently resolute. He had been at Killian's father's side for 11 years and at Killian's for 9, and there was no living person whose loyalty Killian trusted more completely, which was precisely why this conversation was going to be difficult. The men are talking, Finn said. The men are always talking. Not like this. A pause. Finn turned his coffee cup on the table, a slow, circular motion, something to do with his hands. Declan thinks you've lost your nerve. Reardon thinks it's worse than that. He thinks you've lost your mind. He let that sit for a moment. I didn't correct either of them, because I didn't know what to say. Killian turned from the window then. He looked at Finn across the length of the kitchen and said nothing, because Finn was not finished and both of them knew it. She is Giovanni Falcone's daughter, Finn said, and there it was, the bedrock of it, the thing under all the other things. She was on our pier on the night her father ambushed us. We lost 2 men, Killian. Brennan has a bullet in his shoulder that the doctor says may or may not come out clean. And you brought her here. Into your house. He pressed his palms flat on the table. You need to tell me why. It was a reasonable request. It was, in fact, the only reasonable request available to a man in Finn's position, and Killian respected him too much to pretend otherwise. She wasn't part of the ambush, Killian said. She was hiding from it. That's what she told you. That's what I assessed. He moved to the table and sat across from Finn, and when he spoke again his voice carried the particular, quiet authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with certainty. She followed one of Giovanni's men to the pier independently. She didn't know about the raid. She was investigating something inside her own father's operation. He watched Finn's face. Which means there is something inside the Falcon network that Giovanni doesn't want his own daughter to see. That is information, Finn. That is the kind of information you do not throw into the harbor. Finn was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the first pale light was breaking over the estate wall, thin and unconvincing. A bird called somewhere in the grounds, once, and was not answered. The men won't see it that way, Finn said finally. The men don't need to see it. They need to hold their tongues and do their jobs. Declan, Killian said evenly, has never once in his life been asked to think beyond the next 48 hours, and I have never asked him to start. What I am asking is that he follows the direction he's given without editorializing. He met Finn's eyes. What I'm asking of you is something different. Finn looked at him steadily. You're asking me to trust you on something you're not fully explaining. I'm asking you to trust me. A beat. You always have. It was true, and they both knew it, and it was also the heaviest card Killian owned, and he spent it rarely. He watched Finn absorb it, watched the older man's jaw tighten and his eyes move to the middle distance and come back, carrying the weight of 9 years of accumulated faith being quietly asked to stretch a little further. How long? Finn asked. Until I know what Giovanni's man was moving, and until I find the leak that gave him our pier. He paused. And until I've decided what she is. Something in Finn's expression shifted at that, something careful and watchful, a man noting a specific word choice without commenting on it yet. Decided what she is. Not decided what to do with her. The distinction was small. It was not nothing. She stays in the East Wing, Killian continued. She doesn't leave the estate. She has access to the library and the garden during daylight hours under Marta's watch. She is not a prisoner and she is not a guest. She is, he reached, briefly, for the word that fit, and found only the honest one. She is a complication I intend to understand before I resolve. Finn nodded, once, slowly. He stood, picked up his coffee cup, and carried it to the sink, and Killian understood this as the gesture it was. The conversation was over because Finn had decided to let it be over, not because it was finished. There was a difference. There had always been a difference, with Finn. He found out about the others from Marta, who missed nothing and said only what was necessary and had therefore been indispensable to 3 generations of Callahan men. She came to him in the study at noon with a tray she hadn't been asked to bring and set it on the side table and told him, while rearranging cups she didn't need to rearrange, that Declan had spent the morning on the phone, that Reardon had been seen twice at the gate in conversation with a man she didn't recognize, and that 2 of the younger men, O'Brien and the one they called Cass, had gone very quiet in the way that young men went quiet when they were waiting to see which way something fell before they committed to a direction. And the girl? Killian asked. Sleeping, Marta said. Or pretending to. She's been awake since 6. I heard her moving in the East Wing. A pause, during which Marta adjusted a cup that was already perfectly positioned. She asked me for a book. What kind? She said it didn't matter, so long as it wasn't about war. Marta's expression, which had not changed, somehow conveyed something very close to approval. I gave her the Heaney. Killian said nothing. He turned the ring on his finger once and looked at the fire and thought about a woman he had brought into his house like a complication and who had asked, in her first waking hour inside it, not for a phone or an exit or a weapon, but for a book. Who had specified, with the precision of someone who knew her own mind very well, what she didn't want. She was standing at the tall window with the Heaney collection open in one hand and her other arm crossed over her body in the way people hold themselves when they are cold or uncertain and unwilling to admit to either. She had changed into clothes Marta had sourced, dark trousers, a gray sweater several sizes too generous, and her hair was loose and still faintly damp at the ends from a shower, and she looked, in the bluish light coming off the street beyond the glass, startlingly young and startlingly unguarded in a way she would not have permitted herself to look had she known he was there. He didn't announce himself. He moved to the drinks cabinet and poured 2 glasses and set one on the arm of the chair nearest to her, and she startled only slightly, barely a tremor, quickly controlled, and then looked at the glass and at him and said, "How bad is it?" "Manageable," he said. "For tonight." She nodded and closed the book and sat, not in the chair nearest to her but in the one across from it, the one that faced his, equidistant from the fire. He noticed the choice. He suspected she had intended him to. They did not speak for a while. The fire worked. The city outside kept its cold blue vigil. Somewhere below them, Finn's voice moved through the walls in a low, unintelligible murmur: management, containment, the ordinary language of a situation being held together by careful hands. It was Sia who broke it, and she broke it sideways, the way she seemed to do everything, not directly, but at an angle that arrived somewhere more precise than directness would have. "What was his name?" she asked. "The poet. The one your mother left you." He looked at her. He had not told her about his mother, or the book. There was only one person in this house who could have. "Marta talks," he said. "Marta is lonely," Sia said. "There's a difference." She looked at the Heaney in her lap. "She said your mother used to read aloud from it in the evenings. That the sound of it made the house feel less like what it was." A pause. "I thought that was a very sad thing to say about a house." Killian said nothing. He turned the ring on his finger, once, and looked at the fire. "My mother had a garden," Sia said then, and her voice was careful, the voice of a person carrying something fragile and choosing, for reasons they have not fully explained to themselves, to carry it in front of someone else for a moment. "In the Falcone house in the South End. She grew things that had no business growing in Boston: jasmine, bougainvillea, plants that needed warmth that this city never actually provides. She spent half the year fighting the climate to keep them alive." The ghost of something crossed her face. She said it was the only argument she ever won. "She sounds like someone who understood what it meant to insist on beauty inside an ugly situation," Killian said. He hadn't intended to say it. It arrived fully formed, bypassing the usual machinery of his caution, and he felt the slight, internal register of a man who has surprised himself. Sia looked at him, really looked, the kind of looking that takes inventory. "Yes," she said quietly. That's exactly what she was. The fire shifted, settling deeper into itself. Outside, a vehicle moved slowly past the estate, official, deliberate, the beam of a searchlight grazing the upper windows for a moment before moving on. Neither of them flinched. They had both, Killian supposed, grown up learning not to flinch at the particular sounds of power reminding you it was present. "Can I ask you something?" Sia said. "You're going to regardless." The corner of her mouth moved. "Did you ever want something other than this?" He considered refusing the question. It was the kind of question that had no safe answer, that was either a trap or an intimacy, and at this particular hour, in this particular firelit room with the city locked down outside and no exit available to either of them, he found he was too tired to determine which. So he answered it. "I wanted to study architecture," he said. "When I was 16. I had this idea." He stopped. Started again. "There was a bridge I used to walk across to get to school. Old, iron, nothing significant. But the way it held weight, the way it distributed force across its entire length so that no single point carried more than it could bear, I thought that was the most elegant thing I had ever seen." He looked at the fire. "I told my father." He looked at me the way he looked at things that were not useful and said, "The Callahan name is the only structure that matters." And that was the end of it. Sia was quiet for a moment. Then, he wasn't wrong, entirely. He was just wrong about which thing he was building. Killian looked at her. "He was talking about power," she said. "You were talking about something that holds people up without them noticing the weight. Those aren't the same thing." She turned the book over in her hands. "My father sent me to study economics in Florence for 2 years. International finance, portfolio management, everything required to understand how money moves across borders without leaving fingerprints. I came back and he gave me a dinner party to host and a charity board to sit on and told me that the education had been for my own enrichment." Her voice was perfectly level. He had spent 2 years building a weapon and then decided he preferred a ornament. The word landed in the room and stayed there, ornament, sharp and private and carrying the specific bitterness of an injustice that has been lived with long enough to be named without drama. Is that why you followed his men to the pier? Killian asked. Because you knew what the education was actually for and you decided to use it yourself. She held his gaze. I knew something was moving through my father's network that wasn't product and wasn't money. Something that was making men I had known my whole life nervous in a way I had never seen them nervous before. She paused. I was trying to find out what. I'm still trying. So are we, Killian said. The word, we, sat between them, small and irregular, like a stone that had arrived from somewhere neither of them had been looking. Neither of them moved to take it back. Outside, the searchlight made another slow pass. Inside, the fire burned lower and neither of them rose to feed it, and the room contracted gently around them the way rooms do in the deep hours of a night that has stopped pretending it will be brief, into something smaller, warmer, and irreversibly shared. At some point past midnight, Sia fell asleep in the chair across from him, the Heaney sliding from her loosened grip to rest open-spined on the rug. Killian reached across and picked it up without waking her and set it on the side table, and he sat for a long time in the firelit quiet looking at nothing in particular, turning the ring on his finger with the slow, unconscious rhythm of a man who is thinking about bridges. It happened on the 4th day, which was 3 days longer than it should have taken and 1 day sooner than either of them was prepared for. The lockdown had lifted on the 2nd morning, quietly, the way federal pressure always eventually lifted, not withdrawn so much as redistributed, the apparatus of official attention finding something elsewhere to press against. Killian's men had exhaled collectively and returned to their routines, and the estate had opened again to the ordinary commerce of Callahan business, phone calls, deliveries, the low, constant hum of an organization maintaining itself. Declan had stopped hovering near the east corridor. Reardon had stopped watching the door. Sia had not left. He had not asked her to, and she had not raised it, and they had both permitted this, the continued fact of her presence, to exist without being named, the way you sometimes permit a candle to burn in a room you are no longer occupying because extinguishing it requires an acknowledgement that you were there at all. She had moved through the estate's allowed spaces with the careful, unobtrusive self-possession of a woman long accustomed to navigating rooms that did not entirely belong to her. She read. She walked the garden in the thin March light, her breath visible, her hands in the pockets of the oversized coat that had somehow become, in 4 days, simply hers. She spoke to Marta in the kitchen in the evenings, and Marta spoke back, and Killian had discovered, with a discomfort he continued not to examine, that he had begun to notice the sound of her voice through walls. On the 4th day, he found her in the library. Not the study, the library was a different room, further along the east wing, less used, its shelves carrying the particular smell of books that have not been opened in years and are somehow richer for it. She was standing on the lower rung of the rolling ladder, reaching for something on the upper shelf, and the gray sweater had ridden up slightly at the hem with the stretch of it, and the late afternoon light came through the narrow windows at an angle that caught the side of her face and held it. She had not heard him come in. He should have announced himself, as he had not done in the study on the night of the lockdown and had told himself since was a habit he would correct. He did not. He stood in the doorway of his own library and watched Giovanni Falcone's daughter reach for a book on his grandfather's shelf, and he felt something shift in his chest with the slow, tectonic inevitability of a thing that has been moving for days and only now become audible. She got the book, a collection of Irish historical maps, which surprised him, and descended the ladder and turned and saw him, and did not startle this time. That was new. 3 days ago she had still been startling. The fact that she no longer did was information he received without knowing what to do with it. You have a 1798 survey of Connaught in here, she said, holding up the book as though this were a continuation of a conversation they had been having. Do you know how rare these are? My grandfather collected them, Killian said. He believed that owning a map of a place was a form of owning the place. That sounds exactly like something a man in your family would believe. She said it without cruelty. It was simply an observation, delivered with the directness he had come to recognize as the natural register of her intelligence, unfiltered by the social performance most people maintained in his presence. She opened the book to a page and studied it and said, without looking up, "Where does your territory actually end?" The real boundary, not the official one. He crossed the room and stood beside her, not behind her, beside her, close enough that he could see the page she was looking at, and he put his finger on the map at a point just north of the waterfront and drew it in a slow arc west, and she watched his hand move with the focused attention she gave to everything she considered worth understanding. "And the Falcon boundary?" he asked. She took the book from him, her fingers brushing his briefly, practically, without comment, and turned to a different page, a broader survey, and placed her own finger at a point in the south end and drew it east toward the waterfront. The two lines, had they been drawn on the same map, would have met somewhere near the water. Would have overlapped, slightly, in the gray zone where both families had been quietly bleeding each other for 30 years. "There," she said. "That's where your fathers decided to hate each other." "They decided before that," Killian said. "The territory was the excuse, not the reason." She looked up at him. They were close, the geography of the moment had arrived at closeness without either of them engineering it, and the book was still open between them and the late light was still doing its precise, unhelpful work on her face, and Killian was aware, with a clarity he would have preferred not to have, that he had not been this close to her since the shipping container. That in the container he had been armed, and she had been frightened, and the distance between them had been filled with the clean, manageable grammar of threat and counter-threat. There was nothing clean about this distance. There was nothing manageable about it at all. "Killian," she said. Just his name. The way she had said it on the pier, flat and precise, except that it was not flat now, and it was not precise. It was something else. It was his name in a voice that had run out of its usual careful scaffolding and was standing without it, and he understood in that moment that she was frightened again, and that it was entirely different from the fear in the container. That fear had been of what he might do to her. This was something she was afraid she might do herself. He took the book from her hands and set it on the shelf beside them. He did this slowly, giving them both the length of that movement to find a reason to step back, to recollect the 30 years of their father's hatred and the Callahan ring on his finger and the men downstairs who were already suspicious of his mercy. He found no reason sufficient. He suspected she found none either, because she did not move. He brought his hand up and moved the fall of dark hair from her face with the back of his fingers, the lightest possible contact, barely contact at all, something that could still have been practical, could still have been impersonal, and she closed her eyes for a single breath, and that was the moment. That was the first crack. Not the kiss itself but the closing of her eyes, the decision, made without words, to stop looking at everything long enough to feel one thing. He kissed her the way a man kisses something he knows he has no right to and cannot give back, carefully, and completely, and with the full weight of every wall he had spent 9 years building coming down in the quiet of a room that smelled of old maps and history and the specific, irreversible scent of her. She kissed him back. There was nothing tentative in it once it began. She was not a tentative person, and whatever she had been afraid of moments before had apparently resolved itself into a different kind of certainty, and her hands found the lapel of his jacket and held it with the focused, deliberate grip of a woman who has made a decision and intends to inhabit it fully. When they broke apart it was gradual, reluctant, the way you surface from something deep. The library held them in its particular silence. The light had shifted, later now, the room edging toward dusk, and somewhere below them the estate continued its ordinary life, entirely unaware that something above it had just changed in a way that could not be unchanged. Sia looked at him. Her expression was the most unguarded he had seen it, all the careful architecture of her composure temporarily suspended, something younger and more honest in its place. She did not say this is a mistake. He did not say this changes nothing. They were both too precise with language to say things they did not mean. The map was wrong anyway, she said finally, quietly. The boundaries always are. Killian looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the book from the shelf, closed it, and placed it carefully back in the gap it had left, the gap his grandfather had made, charting territories he believed could be owned, boundaries he believed would hold. He turned the ring on his finger, once. The wolf's head was warm against his skin, warmer than usual, or perhaps he was simply, for the first time in a very long time, paying attention to warmth. He said nothing. He did not need to. The point of no return had the particular quality of all such points, it was only visible, perfectly and entirely, once you were already past it. The message came the way Giovanni Falcone did everything, elegantly, and without mercy. It arrived on the 6th morning in the form of a man Killian had never seen before, standing at the estate's front gate in a charcoal suit that had not been bought in Boston, carrying a white envelope with no name on it. He did not speak to the men who intercepted him. He held out the envelope and waited, with the patient, faintly bored expression of someone who has delivered messages for powerful people long enough to understand that his own continued health depended entirely on the impression of absolute neutrality. Declan brought the envelope to Finn. Finn brought it to Killian without opening it, which told Killian something about how it had been sealed. He was in the study. He opened it at his desk with a letter knife, unhurriedly, the way he opened everything that was designed to unsettle him, by refusing to be unsettled by the design of it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, heavy stock, no letterhead. Giovanni's handwriting was precise and spare, the penmanship of a man who had been educated by people who believed that beauty and discipline were the same virtue. It read, "Return what belongs to me by Friday midnight. Should you require motivation, I have enclosed a current account of what belonging to me actually costs. My patience, like my city, has limits. G.F." Beneath the letter was a second sheet. Killian unfolded it and looked at it for a long time without changing his expression, which required more effort than it usually did. It was a list. 14 names, Callahan business owners, legitimate enterprises, men who ran restaurants and shipping companies and a dry cleaning operation on Hanover Street that had been in the same family since 1961. Beside each name was an address. Beside each address was a single notation, a date, written in the same precise hand, each one within the next 72 hours. Not a thread in language. A schedule. Giovanni Falcone was not telling Killian what he would do. He was showing him what he had already arranged to do, with the calm confidence of a man who did not expect to be disbelieved. 14 names. 14 addresses. 14 fires, or storefronts gutted, or men who would simply not arrive home on the correct evening. The method was irrelevant. The message was the architecture. I can reach everything you have built, and I will dismantle it at my leisure, and the only variable is whether you make me start. Killian folded both sheets and placed them in his jacket pocket and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk, looking at the middle distance. Finn was still in the room, standing by the window with his arms crossed in the manner of a man who has already read the situation in his employer's face and is waiting for confirmation of what he already knows. "How bad?" Finn asked. 14 targets. 72 hours. Killian stood. "He's been planning this since the pier." "Possibly before." Finn was quiet for a moment. "Then, he knows she's here." "He's known since the second day." Killian moved to the window and looked out at the garden, where the March light was doing its unconvincing best against the last of winter. The ghost window closed faster than I expected. Someone helped it close. The implication settled between them, the same implication that had been sitting in the corner of every room in the estate for 6 days, patient and unaddressed. Finn's jaw tightened. He said nothing, which was, Killian had long understood, Finn's most eloquent register. He told Sia himself. He found that he needed to, not for strategic reasons, though there were strategic reasons, but because the letter was about her, and she was not a person to whom things about herself should be delivered second-hand by other people. She had spent enough of her life in that particular arrangement. She was in the garden when he came to find her, standing at the far wall where a climbing rose had been trained against the stone and was just beginning, implausibly, to show the first tight suggestion of a bud. She had her hands in the pockets of the coat and her face tilted up toward the thin sun, and she looked, from the doorway, like someone practicing the entirely reasonable act of pretending things were fine. She heard him coming and turned before he spoke, and she read his face with the swift, accurate literacy she had for faces, a skill, he had come to understand, developed in a household where reading the room had never been optional, and her expression shifted into something composed and braced. "He found me," she said. Not a question. He always knew. Killian stood beside her at the wall and handed her the letter. She read it without rushing, both sheets, and when she finished she folded them with the same careful precision with which they had been written and held them in both hands and looked at the rose. 14 people, she said quietly. Yes. He'll do it. She said it without drama, which made it worse. I want you to understand that. This is not a negotiating position. My father does not negotiate. He states terms and he executes them, and the only thing that changes is the timeline. She turned to look at him. If you keep me here past Friday, he burns 14 lives to prove the point, and then he sends another list. I know, Killian said. Then you know what the answer is. He looked at her steadily. The wind moved through the garden and lifted the ends of her hair, and she didn't reach to settle it, just held his gaze with the particular, unflinching directness that had been, from the first moment in the container, the thing about her that he could least afford and most respected. The answer is not that simple, he said. It is, actually. It's only complicated because of, she stopped. Because of the library. Because of the map and the closed eyes and the wolf's head ring warm against her fingers when she had briefly, involuntarily, held his hand. She didn't say any of it. She was too precise for that, and they were standing in a garden in daylight where precision was required. Because of the last 6 days, she finished, which was honest without being everything. If I go back, she said, more quietly, he puts me in a room and locks the door and calls it protection, and whatever I found at the pier, whatever his man was moving, whatever has been making the Falcon network nervous, disappears into the machinery and I never find it. And you never find the leak that gave him Pier 9. She paused. We both lose the only thing that matters. Killian looked at the letter in her hands. He thought about the 14 names on the second sheet, about the men who had run the dry cleaning operation on Hanover Street since before Killian was born, who had always kept a jar of hard candies on the counter and given them to children without being asked. About the weight of 14 ordinary lives sitting on the same scale as one extraordinary one. He thought about bridges. About force distributed so that no single point carried more than it could bear. About the fact that he had spent his entire life being the single point, and had never once allowed himself to imagine it differently, and that this was perhaps not the virtue he had been told it was. There is a third option, he said. Sia waited. She was very good at waiting, another quality formed in her father's house, he supposed, where patience had been the only currency a woman was permitted to spend. I don't return you, he said. And I don't keep you. I give you something your father has never once given you in your life. He held her gaze. A choice. You go if you want to go. You stay if you want to stay. And if you stay, we find what his man was moving together, and we find my leak, and we build something that makes the list in that letter irrelevant, not by surrendering to it, but by dismantling the structure that makes it possible in the first place. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere above them a pigeon negotiated with a gutter. The climbing rose made its small, private argument for spring. Sia looked at him for a long time. Then she looked down at the letter in her hands, at her father's precise, beautiful, merciless handwriting, and she folded it once more and held it out to him. Friday is 4 days away, she said. It is. Then we'd better start. He took the letter from her. Their fingers met briefly at the exchange, not the charged, suspended contact of the library, but something quieter and more durable, the touch of two people who have arrived, by separate and difficult roads, at the same decision. He pocketed the letter beside its twin and turned back toward the house, and she fell into step beside him, not behind, not in front, and the estate received them both without comment, as if it had been expecting this arrangement all along. Above them, from the upper floor window that faced the garden, a curtain moved. And was still. He found the proof at 11 o'clock on Thursday night, which gave him precisely 25 hours before Giovanni Falcone's deadline expired and 14 ordinary lives paid for a decision Killian had not yet made. It was Sia who found it first, which was its own kind of reckoning. She had spent the 4 days since the letter in the basement office beside him, quiet, focused, working through the Falcon network's financial architecture with the unhurried precision of someone who had studied in Florence for 2 years and come home to a charity board and had been furious about it ever since. She cross-referenced shipping manifests against wire transfer records, traced subsidiary companies through 4 jurisdictions, and built on the desk between them a map of money that moved in patterns too deliberate to be innocent and too carefully routed to be anything other than the work of someone who understood exactly what they were hiding and why. What they were hiding, it emerged, was not product. It was not territory. It was a third party, a consortium of Eastern European interests acquiring controlling stakes in Boston's port infrastructure through a chain of shell companies, with the Falcon network serving as the local facilitator. Not a drug operation. A takeover. Slow, legal in its instruments, catastrophically effective in its ambition, within 18 months, by SIA's calculations, the consortium would control enough of the port's operational capacity to make both the Callahan and Falcon networks functionally redundant. Tenants in a building that had once been theirs. Giovanni Falcone, SIA said, looking at the document spread across the desk with an expression Killian could not entirely read, had known about this for at least a year. He had not been facilitating it in ignorance. He had made a private arrangement, survival terms, most likely, a guaranteed position inside the new structure in exchange for cooperation, and he had kept it from his own network. From his own daughter. He was going to let them dismantle everything, she said. And then hand me to whatever was left and call it a future. Killian said nothing. He looked at the documents and thought about the raid on Pier 9, about how clean the intelligence had seemed, how reliable his source had been for 2 years, how completely and surgically the ambush had been arranged. He thought about the curtain moving at the upper window. He thought about Finn. He did not want it to be Finn. He wanted it to be Declan, who was blunt and faithless in the manageable way of men who were loyal to outcomes rather than people. He wanted it to be Reardon, who had been seen at the gate twice. He wanted it to be anyone who had not stood at his father's side for 11 years and at his for 9, anyone whose faith had not been the fixed point against which he had measured the reliability of everything else. He found Finn in the kitchen at 11:30, which was where Finn went when he couldn't sleep, a habit Killian had known about for years and never remarked upon. Finn was standing at the counter with a cup of tea gone cold at his elbow, looking at his phone. He put it face down when Killian came in. The gesture was small and it was one beat too slow, and it told Killian, with a finality he felt in his back teeth, everything he had not wanted to know. He sat at the table. He did not speak immediately. He gave them both the courtesy of a moment, the last moment of 9 years in which things between them were still, technically, what they had always been. You told him she was here, Killian said. On the second day. Finn did not deny it. That, too, told him something, that Finn had known this conversation was coming and had decided, somewhere in the long arithmetic of the past week, that he would not compound the thing with a lie. He turned from the counter and crossed his arms and looked at Killian with the face of a man who believes he has done a necessary thing and has not yet stopped believing it. Someone had to, Finn said. Someone had to, Killian repeated. The words arrived back in the room stripped of everything except their shape, which was not a comfortable shape. You were keeping her. You were, Finn stopped. Started again. I have watched you build this organization from the inside out for 9 years. I watched what it cost you. I watched you bury your father and put that ring on your finger and not flinch, not once, not in front of a single person, because you understood what it meant to carry the name. And then you brought her in here and I watched something happen to you that I have never seen happen to you before, and I was frightened. His voice was level, but underneath it was the particular frequency of a man saying a true thing he had been carrying alone for too long. Not of her. Of what you would lose. Of what you would burn. You decided that for me, Killian said quietly. 9 years, and you decided that for me. I decided it for the network. For Brennan, who still has a bullet fragment in his shoulder. For the 14 people on that list who are there because you chose to keep a Falcon woman in a Callahan house. Finn's jaw tightened. I did not sell you out. I attempted to restore an order that you were dismantling, one day at a time, without seeming to notice. I noticed, Killian said. I was choosing. The kitchen held them both in its silence. The cold tea sat between them like an object from a different era. Outside, the estate was quiet in the way it was only quiet very late at night, all the ordinary sounds of occupation suspended, the building briefly and entirely itself. Did you give him Pier 9? Killian asked. Something crossed Finn's face, an involuntary contraction, the expression of a man who has prepared for one accusation and found himself presented with a worse one. No, he said, and the word was clean and immediate, without the half-second of internal organization that preceded a lie. No. I didn't know about Pier 9 until it was happening. Whatever gave him that intelligence, it wasn't me. Killian looked at him for a long moment, reading the face he had read for 9 years, applying every instrument of assessment he possessed. He believed him. He believed him about Pier 9, which meant the leak in his network was still open, still breathing, still embedded somewhere in the structure below Finn's level. The knowledge sat alongside everything else, one more weight on a scale that was already difficult to hold. "What did Giovanni offer you?" Killian asked. Finn's expression shifted, a flicker of something that in another man might have been shame and in Finn had no clean name. "Nothing. He offered nothing. I contacted him." A pause. "I thought if he knew she was here, he would call the letter off. That it would resolve cleanly. Return the girl, restore the boundary, everyone steps back. He sent the list the same morning," Killian said. "I know. Which means he had it prepared before you called. Which means the call didn't create the ultimatum." Killian leaned back in his chair. It only confirmed for him that the estate had a fracture he could use. Finn closed his eyes briefly, the expression of a man understanding, at full resolution, the precise shape of the mistake he has made. He had tried to restore order and handed a calculating enemy the proof of disorder instead. He had acted out of loyalty and given Giovanni Falcone a lever. It was the kind of error that only very loyal, very certain people made, the error of believing that good intention was sufficient architecture. Killian stood. He stood slowly, the way he did everything when he was most controlled, and he looked at Finn across the length of the kitchen, across 9 years, across his father's memory, across the accumulated weight of a faith that had just revealed its limits, and he said what needed to be said. "You are relieved from operational duties until further notice. You will stay in the estate. You will not contact anyone inside or outside this network without my direct instruction." He paused. "And you will not contact Giovanni Falcone again. On any terms. For any reason." Finn absorbed this without argument. His arms uncrossed, and he stood a little differently, not smaller, but redistributed, the way a structure changes when a load-bearing element is removed. He nodded, once, with the dignity of a man accepting a consequence he cannot dispute. Killian left the kitchen and walked back through the corridor toward the stairs, and he did not turn the ring on his finger. He held his hand flat at his side and felt the weight of it, the wolf's head, the silver, the inheritance, and he thought about what Finn had said. "I watched something happen to you that I have never seen happen to you before." He thought about what it meant that Finn, who had known him for 9 years and watched him bury his father without flinching, had looked at him over the past 6 days and seen something new. He thought about whether that something was weakness, which was what Finn believed, or whether it was something that had no name yet in the vocabulary of men who had spent their lives learning only the language of power. He reached the top of the stairs. The east wing corridor was dark and quiet. Somewhere behind its furthest door, Sia Falcone was awake, he knew without needing to check, the way he had known all week, the awareness of her presence in the building having settled into him like a compass finding its bearing. 24 hours until Friday midnight. One leak still unidentified. A consortium dismantling the city from the inside. And a man he had trusted completely who had, out of genuine love for him, handed his enemy a weapon. He stood at the top of the stairs in the dark of his grandfather's house and understood, with perfect and terrible clarity, that he was out of time for half measures. That the moment coming toward him required not the cold calculus of a man managing a situation but something he had spent his entire life deliberately never becoming. A man who had chosen. He went alone. That was the first decision, and it was the one that told him everything about how far he had come from the men who had walked onto Pier 9 8 days ago believing the only language power respected was more power. Sia had argued against it with the focused intensity of someone who has spent a lifetime watching men walk confidently toward preventable ends. She stood in the study at 10 o'clock on Friday morning with the consortium documents spread across the desk between them and said that going to the Falcone estate without men was not courage, it was arithmetic, specifically, the arithmetic of 1 against however many Giovanni chose to have waiting. Killian listened to all of it. He did not change his position. "If I bring men," he said, "it is a siege. And a siege requires him to defend, and a man defending his own ground in front of his own people will never concede anything, regardless of what evidence we put on the table. He has to be given a way to hear this that doesn't require him to be destroyed by it in front of witnesses." He looked at her. "I'm not going to fight your father. I'm going to talk to him." "He doesn't talk," she said. "I told you that. He hasn't had a reason to yet." She looked at him for a long moment across the desk and the documents and the 8 days of everything that had accumulated between them, and then she picked up the envelope containing Sia's compiled evidence, 3 years of financial architecture reduced to irrefutable sequence, and held it out to him. He took it. Their hands did not linger at the exchange. The moment was too serious for that, and they were both too serious for anything other than the moment. "If he doesn't listen," she said, "you leave. Promise me." He looked at her, and did not promise, because he was not a man who made promises he was uncertain he could keep. Instead he said, "Be ready to move when I get back," which was its own kind of answer, and she received it as such. The Falcone estate sat in the south end behind a wall of old brick and older money, its facade the particular shade of composed that only comes from generations of practice. Killian arrived at the front gate at noon, alone, in a car he drove himself, and he sat for a moment in the quiet before getting out, not from fear, but from the instinct of a man giving himself one final, clear look at the shape of what he was about to do. He was walking into his enemy's house with no leverage and no men and one envelope, to tell Giovanni Falcone that the world had changed beneath his feet and that the daughter he had spent 23 years managing was the only person who had seen it clearly enough to matter. He was doing this not because strategy demanded it but because Sia had closed her eyes in a library and held his lapel, and he had not been the same man since, and the person he had become was one who understood, at last, bone deep, without reservation, that the structures worth protecting were not the ones built from fear. He got out of the car and walked to the gate and gave his name, and after a pause long enough to establish that he was being assessed, the gate opened. Giovanni Falcone received him in a sitting room on the first floor, not the study, which would have been the room of a man willing to conduct business, but a sitting room, which was the room of a man who intended to remind his visitor of the precise register of his contempt. It was furnished with the kind of quiet extravagance that announced itself without trying: old paintings, good rugs, a window overlooking a garden where something was, impossibly, blooming. Bougainvillea, Killian thought, against a south-facing wall. He understood then, completely, and without needing to be told, what Sia had meant when she said her mother had insisted on beauty inside an ugly situation. Giovanni stood at the window with his hands behind his back. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the build of a man who had once been physically formidable and had transferred that quality entirely into stillness as he aged. He did not turn when Killian entered. He let him cross the room and stand and wait, which was a power statement so old and so obvious that Killian almost found it restful. At least it was a language he knew. "You have until the clock strikes 1, Giovanni said, still facing the window. Then the list becomes active and you leave my house through whichever exit my men choose for you." Killian set the envelope on the table between them. "Read that first," he said. "Then decide what you want to do with your hour." Giovanni turned. He looked at the envelope with the expression of a man calculating whether to be intrigued or insulted, and then he crossed to the table and opened it, and Killian stood quietly while he read. He watched Giovanni's face move through the first page with controlled attention, through the second with something fractionally less controlled, and arrive at the third, the page that named the consortium, the timeline, and the private arrangement Giovanni had made with them, with an expression that had no calculation in it at all. Just the brief, unguarded face of a man seeing something he had believed was invisible suddenly rendered in full daylight. He set the papers down. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. When he spoke, his voice had lost the sitting room register entirely. It was simply a man's voice, older than it had sounded a minute ago. "Where did you get this?" "Your daughter built it," Killian said. "From the financial records she spent 2 years learning to read in Florence. The education you gave her and then decided not to use." Something moved across Giovanni's face, complex, layered, not entirely readable. Pride and injury in the same motion, the expression of a father who has underestimated his child and is discovering it at the worst possible moment. She mapped your arrangement with the consortium, Killian continued. She identified the shell companies, the acquisition timeline, the port infrastructure targets. She understood what your man was moving before I did. Before, I think, most of your own people did. He paused. She was trying to protect you. From the inside of a shipping container on a pier where your men were trying to kill mine, she was still trying to protect you. Giovanni looked at him across the table. His hands, Killian noticed, had settled flat on the papers, the same posture Killian himself used when he was doing his most careful thinking. The parallel was not comfortable. And you, Giovanni said. What are you trying to do? This was the moment. Killian had known it was coming and had not prepared a speech for it, because he had understood that the only version of this conversation that could work was one without a speech, without strategy or calculation or the careful management of impression that had governed every significant exchange of his adult life. He had come here without men. He would speak without armor. I'm telling you that the consortium will render both our networks obsolete within 18 months unless we move against it together. I'm telling you that your daughter identified this before either of us, and that she is the most capable person either of us knows, and that you have spent 23 years making a weapon and calling it an ornament, and she has been quietly becoming something neither of those things. He held Giovanni's gaze. And I'm telling you that I am in love with her. Not as a strategy. Not as leverage. As a fact I arrived at against every instinct I possess, and which I am not going to stop being true regardless of what you do in the next 45 minutes. The room was very still. Outside in the garden, the bougainvillea moved in a wind that did not reach the glass. Giovanni looked at him for a long time. He looked at him the way Sia looked at things, with inventory, with patience, with the willingness to sit inside an uncomfortable silence until it told him what it actually contained. Killian understood that he was being assessed by the same intelligence that had produced the woman he loved, and he did not look away. 30 years, Giovanni said finally, very quietly. 30 years of Callahans and Falcons. He looked down at the papers under his hands. My father told me the feud was the only thing keeping us honest. That without an enemy, a man like us lost his shape. Our fathers were wrong about a great many things, Killian said. That, I think, was the foundational one. Another silence. The clock on the mantel moved its minute hand with the small, indifferent click of a mechanism that does not care what is at stake. Giovanni picked up the papers and squared them carefully against the table's edge, the gesture of a man returning to precision after a moment of being without it. He did not hand them back. He held them, and he looked at the window, and he said, the list. It won't be activated. Killian let the breath he had not known he was holding move quietly out of him. I want full documentation of the consortium's acquisition timeline, Giovanni continued. I want a meeting, neutral ground, this week, to discuss what a coordinated response requires. He paused. And I want to see my daughter. She'll want to see you, Killian said. He meant it without qualification, because it was true. Sia had not stopped loving her father in the library, or the garden, or the basement office where she had built the case against his arrangement with patient, devastating care. She had been angry at what he had made of her, and she had been right to be. Both things were true simultaneously, the way the most important things always were. He picked up his coat from the chair. Giovanni did not offer his hand and Killian did not extend his. They were not, quite yet, in a world where that was possible. But as Killian reached the door, Giovanni spoke once more, without turning from the window. Callahan. A pause waited with 30 years of architecture being quietly revised. She takes after her mother. Killian stopped at the door. He thought about a woman who had grown bougainvillea in Boston and called it winning. He thought about the daughter who had brought jasmine into a shipping container in the form of expensive perfume and defiance, and had walked out of it into his life and taken up permanent residence without asking permission. Yes, he said. She does. He walked out of the Falcone estate into the thin March afternoon, and he drove back across the city without hurry, through streets that looked, for the first time in as long as he could remember, like somewhere a person might actually choose to live. 3 weeks after Friday midnight came and went without 14 fires, Boston continued its ordinary life with the cheerful indifference of a city that never knew how close it had come to something irreversible. The harbor moved. The streets filled and emptied. The dry cleaning shop on Hanover Street opened at 8 o'clock each morning with its jar of hard candies on the counter, and the men who ran it turned the sign from closed to open without knowing that a room had once held his name on a list beside an address and a date, and that the list had been folded into a jacket pocket and never activated. He could not have known. That was, Killian thought, precisely as it should be. The consortium had moved faster than either of them anticipated once the combined pressure of Callahan and Falcone intelligence was applied to the right points in the right sequence. Sia had coordinated the financial dismantling from the basement office, the same desk, the same spread of documents, except that now her father's people were on the phone alongside Killian's, and the architecture she had built to expose the problem became the instrument for solving it. 3 shell companies were dissolved inside a week. The port acquisition was flagged to federal oversight through a channel clean enough not to draw attention to the hands that had flagged it. The Eastern European Consortium, finding its quiet takeover suddenly and comprehensively illuminated, withdrew with the dignified speed of people who understood when a position had become untenable. It was not clean. It was not simple. There were conversations in neutral rooms that required every skill both families possessed, the Callahan facility for controlled force, the Falcone facility for financial precision, and the thing that neither family had possessed before, which was Sia sitting at the center of it all, translating between 2 languages that had spent 30 years refusing to share a sentence. She was not a weapon. She was not an ornament. She was, as it turned out, the only person in the room who had always been fluent in both. Giovanni came to the estate once, on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, and sat in Killian's study in the wing-back chair that had belonged to Killian's father. It should have been strange. It was, in fact, one of the stranger afternoons of Killian's life, 2 men who had inherited 30 years of mutual destruction sitting across a desk exchanging documents about Port Authority oversight procedures. But Giovanni drank the Jameson Killian poured without comment, and he read what needed to be read, and when he left he paused in the doorway and looked at the room with an expression that contained something Killian was only able to identify later, driving home through the city. He was looking at the room the way you look at something you have spent a long time believing was your enemy and are only now considering might have simply been your mirror. Finn remained at the estate. He was not restored to operational authority, that conversation had not yet been fully had, and Killian was not a man who rushed past the shape of things, but he was present, and present in the way of a man who has accepted the terms of a revised arrangement and is living inside them with the quiet discipline of someone who understands that trust, once it has shown its limits, must be rebuilt from a lower floor. He spoke to Killian when spoken to and did not presume beyond it, and Killian found, with some surprise, that he did not want him gone. What Finn had done had been wrong. What Finn had felt had been true. Both things continued to be simultaneously real, and Killian, who had spent his life preferring clarity to complexity, was slowly learning to hold them both. It was Sia who found the balcony. It was on the upper floor of the estate, accessible through a door at the end of the corridor that Killian had not opened in years, not from avoidance, simply from the accumulated inattention of a man who had never had a reason to look at the city from above when he was always managing it from within. She had discovered it on her second week, characteristically, by following a corridor to its end to see what was there, and she had come to find him in the study afterward with a look of quiet accusation. "You have a balcony," she said. "I know. You never use it." "I never had a reason to." She had looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding not to say the obvious thing, which was one of her most effective expressions because it said the obvious thing anyway. Then she had gone back to the documents on her desk, and he had returned to his, and that evening he had gone upstairs and opened the door and stood on the balcony alone in the cold for 10 minutes, looking at Boston spread below him in its evening lights, and felt something he did not immediately have a word for, something that was not contentment, which was too passive, and not triumph, which was too loud. Something quieter than both. Something that had to do with looking at a thing you have managed from the inside and finding, from the outside, that it was larger and more various and more worth the trouble than the managing of it had allowed you to see. He had gone back inside and said nothing about it. But the door, after that, stayed unlocked. On the last evening of March, 3 weeks and 4 days after the shipping container, After the study and the kitchen and the library and the map and the letter and the Falcone sitting room and everything that had accumulated in the spaces between, he found her on the balcony at dusk. She was leaning against the railing with her arms folded on the stone and her chin resting on them, looking at the city with the focused, private attention she gave to things she was trying to understand completely. She had her own coat now. Not the oversized Falcone one that had been simply hers, that one had been returned to the wardrobe with the quiet ceremony of things that had served their purpose, but something she had retrieved from the south end along with a small number of other belongings, in the way of a person arranging themselves gradually, without announcement, into a new geography. Marta had not commented. Marta had simply, on the morning after the relevant bag arrived, made enough coffee for two and set both cups on the kitchen counter without being asked. Killian stood beside her at the railing. Boston lay below them in the particular light of early spring, not warm yet, not fully, but carrying the credible suggestion of warmth to come, the way a room carries the scent of something good before the thing itself arrives. The harbor was visible from here, dark and restless. The north end's lights. The south end's. The long, illuminated spine of the waterfront that both families had bled for and over and along for 30 years, and which was, slowly and with considerable legal complexity, becoming something neither of them had built. "It's a good city," Sia said. Not a remarkable observation, except that she said it the way people say things they have had to arrive at, not received wisdom, but a conclusion earned. "It is," Killian said. "My mother would have liked the view from here." She said it simply, without the careful scaffolding she sometimes still erected around the things that mattered most. It arrived clean and undefended and he received it the same way. "Tell me about her," he said. Sia looked at him. In the fading light her face was open in the way it had been in the library, that same temporary suspension of architecture, the same quality of being present without management. Then she looked back at the city and she told him, the garden, the jasmine, the arguments with the Boston climate that she had won through sheer insistence. The way she read aloud in the evenings not from poetry but from history, because she believed, she had said, that the only way to stop repeating a thing was to understand it so thoroughly that repetition became impossible. The way she had looked at Giovanni, with the clear, unflinching regard of a woman who loved a complicated man without pretending he was simple. Killian listened to all of it. He looked at the city while she spoke and he thought about his own mother, and the book of Irish verse she had left him that he had never properly read, and the evenings she had spent making a house feel like something other than what it was, and he thought that perhaps the two women, the Callahan wife and the Falcone wife, who had never once in their lives been in the same room, had understood something about the men they had married and the world those men inhabited that the men themselves had never quite arrived at. That beauty was not decoration. That it was, in fact, the only form of resistance that compounded over time. When Sia finished, the last of the light had gone and the city was entirely its evening self, luminous, various, indifferent to the histories being quietly revised above it. He put his hand over hers on the stone railing and she turned her hand beneath his and held it, without comment, with the easy certainty of people who have moved past the part that requires comment. The wolf's head ring was warm between their hands. He felt it, registered it, the way he had in the library, the way he had at the top of the stairs on Thursday night. Only now it did not feel like inheritance pressing down. It felt like something being held between two people rather than carried by one. He thought about bridges. About the old iron one he had walked to school as a boy, and the way it had distributed its weight so precisely that no single point carried more than it could bear. He had wanted, at 16, to spend his life building things like that, structures that held people up without them knowing the weight was there. He had been told that the Callahan name was the only structure that mattered, and he had believed it, and he had spent 20 years being the single point of everything and calling it strength. He understood now, standing on a balcony he had never used, in a city that was rearranging itself below him, with a woman beside him who had walked out of a shipping container and into the foundational structure of his life, that his father had not been entirely wrong. The Callahan name was a structure. It simply had not, until now, been bearing the right weight. Sia leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a small thing and a complete one, the gesture of a woman who has decided, with full knowledge of the cost and the history and the 30 years of cobblestones between them, that this is where she has chosen to be. He did not speak. He did not need to. He looked at the city, his city, her city, the city that had been their father's shadow and was now simply what it had always been beneath all of that, a place full of ordinary people living ordinary lives in the full, unexamined faith that the structures holding them up would continue to hold. He intended, for the first time in his life, to make that faith deserved. The rain had stopped. Boston glittered below them, promising nothing and everything, the way good cities always do.